Thanks very much. I'm delighted to be here among you all. I'm a political scientist to trade, if you like, so my interest in energy issues is particularly on the policy side and in particular in this case on the capacity of governments to act in this sphere and the extent to which their capacities are constrained. So I'm going to talk specifically about Scotland and look first of all at the energy ambitions of the Scottish Government and the competence, the constitutional competence that it has to act in the energy policy field. It won't have escaped your attention that we have a bit of an event coming next year in the form of an independence referendum, and so I also want to consider for a while what independence might mean for energy. Energy is a particular theme within the independence campaign, particularly around oil and prospects of energy wealth, but I'm going to focus on renewables and what it might mean for renewable electricity ambitions in particular. And look a little bit about the continued scope for cross-border relations in the field and draw some insights from a recent research trip to Ireland. Okay, so in terms of Scotland's energy ambitions, they are focused in electricity in renewables and renewable energy. There are very ambitious targets that are at the core of government policy, mainly 2020 targets, which is fast approaching. And the overall target is that 30% of energy demand will be met from renewable sources by 2020. At the centrepiece of that demand is renewable electricity. And again, it's a consumption-based target where the government aims to source 100%, the equivalent of 100% of consumption for electricity from renewable sources by 2020. It had set an interim target for 2011, which it met and surpassed, and has a new 2015 target as another interim target on the path. They are aspirational targets, but they're part of a broader low-carbon agenda, which also includes binding targets on emissions reductions. The Scottish Government the Scottish Parliament passed its own climate change legislation, which included a 2050 target of achieving 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, similar to the target set by the UK government, which also obliges Scotland to follow. But they have a more ambitious 2020 target as an interim target of achieving greenhouse gas emissions reductions of 42% by 2020, which is widely acknowledged as being ambitious and probably in practice difficult to achieve without action taken elsewhere, including at the EU level. But I'm going to focus on the energy side and the renewable electricity side in particular. Just to look for a moment at the picture overall, in terms of electricity generated, the majority is still from fossil fuels, of course, or from nuclear, but 26.8% of all electricity generated in 2011 in Scotland came from renewable sources. I put that up to time myself and forgot to press start, so there we go. Now that's a dramatic increase in a relatively short period of time since 2000, where there has been a significant decline in electricity generated from coal and a massive increase in renewables, particularly in the form of onshore wind. In 2000, other renewables accounted for just 0.6% of electricity generated, but by 2011, it was 16% of the total. So onshore wind is building on an existing hydro capacity, which has been quite extensive for much of the post-war period. This graph provides a better illustration of the targets and progress in terms of consumption in line with the government's ambitions, and it illustrates, I think, quite well the upward trajectory, including the surpassing of the interim target and what looks like being well on track to meeting the second interim target for 2015. But the scale is still, I think, very ambitious in terms of meeting a 2020 target. And this again just gives you further illustration of the sorts of capacity that is potentially out there. There's been an enormous amount of investment in onshore wind in particular, lots of things still in scoping or under construction in the process of coming on stream. Now, one of the remarkable things about this programme is that it has been done with little or no competence in terms of constitutional capacity in the field of energy. When the Scottish Parliament was set up in 1999, most of the powers over energy were reserved to the UK level, reserved to the Westminster Parliament. The Scotland Act, which is the Parliament's founding legislation, had a specific reservation for energy which includes virtually all aspects of electricity, generation, transmission, distribution and supply, the regulation of the industry, although effectively not done by government, is still a responsibility in legislative terms of the UK government. So almost all aspects of energy are reserved, and yet this hasn't been a barrier to acting in an ambitious way, to developing a high-profile, high-ambition agenda. In addition, there also has been a lack of significant borrowing powers or fiscal powers, where the fiscal system might be used to invest or to target resources or to use taxation in innovative ways to encourage investment in the sphere. And there's also a lack of external relations. The European Union has an increasingly important role in energy policy, and when Scotland is trying to engage with the EU, well, formally speaking, it needs to be through the UK level, although in practice there's lots of informal lobbying and engagement directly as well. So what can they do, and what powers do they have at their disposal? Well, they can promote renewable energy and they can promote energy efficiency, and clearly this government in particular, and also to some extent their predecessors, have used those powers to promote to the full. They also have a wide range of powers over domestic policies which impinge upon energy to varying extents. So policy competence over planning, economic development, transport, land use, and so on. And in addition to legislative powers, there are also executive powers which have been particularly important in this sphere, which include the power to grant or withhold consent for overhead transmission lines or for the construction of new generating stations. It's that power that has been invoked by the SNP government to say that they would block any new nuclear build within Scotland. And they have also had the capacity to vary the renewables obligation to provide added incentive for marine renewables with the consent of the UK government. In addition to those, there has been extensive use of what I call soft power, so not formal legal control, but the capacity to engage, to influence, to perhaps lobby, but as a bigger actor than an ordinary lobbying firm, to engage in intergovernmental relations with the UK government, very close collaborative working with DEC in particular, but also with other actors involved as well. Now, all of that is changing regardless of the referendum and regardless of the outcome next year. There is new legislation that has been passed and that will come on stream in Scotland to enhance the fiscal powers of the Scottish Parliament, so potentially it could then start to borrow to invest for capital investment, and it could potentially introduce new taxes to use in this and other spheres. And of course, there's electricity market reform, which, among other things, actually curbs some of the autonomy and scope for discretion that the Scottish Government has had over the renewables obligation. But then there's the referendum, which might change everything or might change only some things or nothing at all. Should Scotland be an independent country? Well, thankfully I'm not going to answer that question right now. That's the question that will be put to the voters next year. The kind of question that one of the things that really interests me about the referendum question is that it's not really very clear what it means. What does it mean to be independent? How independent are we talking about? And there is clearly across the board, across different policy spheres, a desire, a willingness to continue to have cross-border associations, lots of continuities in the relationship with the rest of the UK. And I'm going to talk about how that might be in the energy and electricity sphere in a moment. But even aside from the debate over independence, there's also an ongoing debate on the sidelines around enhanced devolution within the Union. And some proposals have come forward to suggest that energy might be one of those areas that would be devolved to the Scottish Parliament in the future. So another question that's relevant I will pose, and not answer directly, is would self-government, in whatever form, over energy make it easier or harder to realise the ambitions that are inbuilt into the Scottish Government's programme? So, what difference would it make? What's the Scottish Government view? Why do they think it would make it easier, would make it better to have energy independence? Obviously, in terms of oil, it's very easy to see why ownership of oil might be seen to be a benefit in terms of oil revenues. I'm not going to talk about that, but in terms of electricity, it's a little bit less obvious to see what the advantages would be. Mainly, it's around having control over regulation, having oversight of the regulatory framework that better promotes what's called a fair and equitable electricity market. In other words, that is more focused on boosting and promoting renewables. They would also have greater fiscal capacity, they would have a facility to directly engage with the European Union, and they would have enhanced status with respect to the industry and its relations. But they also view that as being with continuities and shared relationships with the rest of the UK within a common GB market. And EU membership, EU regulation, EU directives promote market integration, so there's nothing inherently difficult about market integration and the prospect of a common GB market post-independence. There are numerous examples established or in process elsewhere in Europe. And the EU framework also provides certain protections to facilitate shared access to grids, competition with fair competition, and ability to buy and sell without inhibition. But it is also envisaged that there would be a distinctive regulatory framework. And one of the points that I would emphasise that I think the more constrained you are within a shared market, the less might be the capacity to have a distinctive regulatory framework, which is part of the rationale in the first place. The bigger issue is around finance. Currently, Scotland does benefit from being part of a GB consumer base where costs for subsidising renewables are socialised across the UK, across the UK, and costs for investing in the grid are also socialised across GB. And some have provocatively questioned whether or not this would continue to be the case, and why consumers in south of the border would continue to buy expensive electricity from Scotland from renewables if they can get cheaper stuff elsewhere. The most common answer to that is that so long as the UK is within the EU and committed to an EU target, it can't meet that target itself. Our UK could not meet that target without importing electricity from renewables from somewhere, and one obvious way to do that is to import from Scotland. Briefly, just before closing, some insights are relevant from Ireland and from the island of Ireland, where there is energy devolution already in Northern Ireland. So Northern Ireland has a separate regulator for electricity, but they closely cooperate with their Irish and British counterparts. They still participate in a shared renewable subsidy regime, So costs for subsidising renewables are still socialised across the UK, but Northern Ireland consumers are responsible for upgrades to the grid within Northern Ireland. The UK government and the Irish government have also collaborated very closely as two sovereign states in the area of energy, both to set up the all-island electricity market and to maintain it, but also more recently over a broader renewables agenda. There's potential for a recent memorandum of understanding to lead to an intergovernmental agreement between the Irish and the British, which could potentially see renewable energy generated within Ireland for consumption in the UK. So, in conclusion then, in terms of whether it's possible to still have independence and a common GB market, well, anything is possible if there is a political will and perception of shared interests that it's the case. To some extent, the European Union helps to facilitate that kind of process. It helps to facilitate market integration. But the continued commitment of the UK government to both renewables and indeed to EU membership is now in question. And I think the threat to all of this probably comes more, in my view, from the potential of the UK to disengage to the point of possible withdrawal from the European Union than it does from the issue of Scottish independence. The precedent suggests that even if a GB-wide subsidy were maintained post-independence, then grid upgrade costs, which would be significant if Scotland is to achieve its renewables targets and renewables potential in the outer islands and remote areas of Scotland, well, those costs would probably have to be borne within Scotland. So independence would produce opportunities, but also significant constraints. Thank you.